You are so shameless in your lies. Disgusting.
Hello everybody, this is WarriorDan, and today we're taking a look at Wolcen, Lords of Mayhem. And wow, this game definitely stands out from the rest, in a variety of ways, both good and bad. When Wolcen first kicks off, you're given the option to either play online or offline. Now, this could have been fixed by the time this video goes out, but as of the time of recording, the developers have stated that, bizarrely, progress between the online and offline components will not be shared. So if you play the campaign solo in offline mode but then jump over to online co-op mode, any progress including leveling up with that character in the online mode will not transfer to the offline mode featuring that character. Now in 2020, I have absolutely no idea why any action RPG game that features both online and offline play wouldn't have some kind of cross-save feature. Blizzard has been supporting cross-save in Diablo for roughly at least a decade by now, and even other relatively small action RPGs have been incorporating cross-save. If you're going to allow online co-op in your action RPG game, why would you not develop the framework upon which almost every other action RPG game is designed around? It's frankly embarrassing. But setting that aside, the next thing you'll see is the character customization process, although I strongly hesitate to use the word process here, as that would imply there is at least some effort on the developer's end to allow the player to make it a true transformative experience. Instead, you have a simple choose your gender option, followed by 8 or so eye color choices, maybe 10 or 12 skin color choices, and about a dozen hairstyle options. The only part of the process that gives you more than a handful of options is the hair color palette. Although, given how easy it is to implement a hair color selection option, I would think that this would be a basic requirement for any RPG game. Then you're thrown into this 2-minute long hand-drawn montage of still images, accompanied by narration and some background sound effects. Honestly, the art isn't bad here, but it feels very simplified and out of place when compared with the rest of the game's dark, gothic, more gritty visual tone. Luckily, this is the exception to the rule, as there are a fair amount of in-game cinematics to enjoy. Specifically, following this hand-drawn montage, you have a in-game cinematic that is actually pretty cool. You get this nice moment where you see what feels like a visual nod to the movie 300, with the soldiers fending off incoming arrows from enemy archers by raising their shields to create effectively a metal wall, upon which the arrows bounce off harmlessly. You then have to take a small strike team to infiltrate enemy lines and take out the archers. This goes rather well until you have what is probably simultaneously both the best of luck and the worst of luck in the known universe. You find the earth is starting to collapse in random places, but on this first occasion, it's your enemies that regret it more than you, since they immediately fallen and die like the losers they are, and you somehow live through the fateful intervention of plot armor. However, this is a trade-off, as in return for not having to worry about living enemies, you get some new determinedly undead ones now thrown into the mix. You manage to reunite with your allies and all's looking good, despite there being a weirdo lurking nearby who looks like he's definitely doped up on something that is certainly not legal. Your buddy tries mocking him in the hopes of snapping him out of it a bit. This fails. Your character tries being nice to him, and this also fails. You and your NPC allies begin to walk away. This apparently succeeds where all else had failed. Except while he stopped ranting like a maniac, it's because he unfortunately transformed into a giant, winged, super strong demon lord, which sets its focus on you and your NPC buddies and goes on a villainous monologue about how it wants to enslave you and use you for its own purposes. Clearly, this monster isn't a big fan of women's liberation, or really liberation of any kind. In the middle of your fight, your character decides to one-up him, turning into a similarly sized giant archangel thing, and subsequently beats the hell out of him. I'm not sure how one could literally beat the hell out of a demon, considering demons are begotten from hell, but if anyone could do so, it's your character's angel form. It's at this point that the tutorial, even though it's technically not called a tutorial, ends, and you begin transitioning to the more open-ended world design. Speaking of, let's talk about gameplay. Or rather, time for me to cut to this little montage from my gameplay, because this game definitely lends itself well to being featured as such. Okay, now that I've had my minute or two of fun, time to legit talk about gameplay. The story evolves over a series of main quests, and just like any action RPG, or really any RPG in general, there are plenty of opportunities to engage in side quests, explore and go venturing across the world, as well as fight your way through underground dungeons, where you fight off hordes of enemies and earn high-value loot, find gold, and face new challenges. How you choose to fight off enemies is left, by and large, up to you. In addition to your primary and secondary abilities, both of which you pick at the start of the game, which you can later replace if you choose, you can also buy or otherwise unlock mana-based spells and abilities, which can come in a variety of forms and have a number of different effects. What spells and abilities you can use are determined by your weapon loadout. Certain spells are only for spellcasters, certain abilities are used only by gunslingers or archers, etc. Personally, my character was your typical mage/spellcaster, so my cooldown spells were pretty straightforward. Burning my enemies alive with magic fireballs always feels endlessly satisfying. I also made good use of this necromancy spell, allowing me to summon up to 2 undead archers wherever my cursor is pointed. These undead minions don't exactly have a lot of health, but what they lack in vitality they more than make up for in their ability to output a constant stream of low impact damage, which can be useful in picking off enemy minions that bosses tend to spawn, or it can be useful in dealing poke damage to the boss itself. The enemy variety, always a crucial element behind any great action RPG, is quite diverse. I've currently put in just under 5 hours of gameplay and have already run into easily a dozen, maybe 2 dozen different types of enemies, each for the most part having their own unique attack style, although many of them seem to have the same total amount of health. The world itself feels very distinctly populated. There are a number of vastly different biomes, each with their own unique color tone and environment style. Now let's talk about enemy scaling. You have the basic enemy type with relatively low health and low damage output, the medium tier 2 enemy type with higher damage and health counts, and the elite or mini-boss type enemy, which usually proves far more difficult to kill and generally have both ranged and melee abilities, both of which are pretty strong. Also, the elite or mini-boss type enemies also sometimes have a health meter that appears at the top of the screen, just like you would see in a traditional full-fledged boss. Speaking of, this is where we get into the area of bosses. Currently, I've only faced about a dozen bosses, and I'm not including the tutorial boss here. This is where the game tends to get a little aggravating. Bosses, as anyone who's ever played a action RPG like Diablo can tell you, are enormous damage sponges, soaking up whatever damage you can hurl at them and dealing you grievously critical wounds in return. As if this isn't difficult enough, some bosses, like my least favorite one so far, the dragon, have this irritating habit of summoning basic and medium tier enemies the moment you start dealing any kind of serious damage to it, to the point that it becomes near impossible to lay your hands on it. Then of course you have some bosses that refuse to stay dead the first time you kill them. I had one boss in specific that required me to kill him, or at the very least knock his health down to 0 a number of times before ultimately killing him. It ended up leading to what had to be a 10 to 20 minute long boss battle. The character modeling and attack animations of the bosses are really very refined. Each one feels different to play against. You can't just copy and paste the same tactics over and over again and expect to live for long. Also, in my experience, prepare to die a lot. Wolcen doesn't necessarily venture into Dark Souls territory, but it can be very unforgiving during boss encounters. Though that said, I did see the game over screen saying, "You died," a fair amount of times to recognize that it is at least an attempt at a Dark Souls nod. What makes this a borderline impossibility is the terribly designed UI. There are these inexcusable design flaws that literally force you to relinquish control of your character while you are actively being attacked by enemies in real time. For some bizarre reason, the skill tree is keybound to S, so if you're used to being a WASD type player and you panic and hit S to step back, the game will interrupt the fighting, forcing me to stop and click X to close. This has resulted in my death nearly half a dozen times. I'm all for dying due to my own incompetence, as I can find perfectly legitimate reasons to die all on my lonesome, but I don't like the feeling of dying because I was not in control of my character. I get that this isn't the type of game that embraces WASD controls, but in general, if you're an action RPG developer, here's a public service announcement from those of us who are kind of your fringe fans, the type that kind of dip our toes in and out of the action RPG genre at will. Please do not bind pop-up menus to the WASD keys. Even if the keys aren't going to be used for anything else, just if nothing else, leave them unbound. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least talk about the epic embarrassments that were, respectively, the Day 1 and 2 server failures. During the game's launch on February 13th and 14th, The game was flooded with players, to the point that the game experienced a series of periods where the game servers would be completely down. The game has since somewhat stabilized, although many times when I've tried to log in since, I still see some server problems. But after a few urgent bug fixes, the developers at least have started to get a handle on the situation. Frequent game crashes and the inability to log in and play isn't exactly ideal when you're trying to showcase the best your game can offer to newcomers. Now let's turn to looting. Weapon looting is very commonplace, as can be expected. However, like Diablo, there are consequences for equipping weapons outside your chosen character class. While unlike Diablo, you can choose other types of weapons outside of your class's default weapon type, you won't be able to access your secondary right-click ability, directly limiting the overall damage you could be dealing. So if you're going to swap weapons, it better be for a short duration and for a specific purpose. It's kind of the game's not-so-subtle way of telling you to stick to what you initially signed up for, and not to experiment instead. Where you can experiment is with your game's armor and other equipment. In addition to the default flat defense stats, many types of armor and equipment have secondary passive item stats, such as, but not limited to, increased health regen time, increased mana regen time, increased movement speed, increased chance of dodging enemy attacks, increased resistance to X damage type, etc. You get the idea. Additionally, your primary and secondary mouse attacks automatically level up over time, increasing their total strength and effectiveness, following a similar trajectory as your character's personal leveling system, in my experience almost running parallel to one another. Now let's talk about characters. One, or rather two, of the things the game does pretty well is the writing and voice acting for most of the characters, major and minor alike. There's a lot of decent humor, although nothing I would consider hilarious.
What was that?
She's possessed by a demon.
Yes. Let's hope you're wrong. Otherwise...
Talking to yourself again?
Speak of the devil. Darling, I need a moment. Talk to you later.
A few moments later.
Not some demon, goddammit. Come on, Val.
Oh, really? Prove it.
You're such a tool.
That does not seem like something a demon would say.
Even when you're talking to NPC quest givers or overhearing conversations between background NPCs, you get the feeling that the developers had enough sense not to take the game into an entirely serious direction. This makes for an unexpected but welcome distinction from the more mature and visceral combat sections. At times the humor can toe the line between being appropriate for the situation and just being blatantly excessive or cringeworthy, but luckily this only becomes apparent in the minority of instances, not the majority. Overall, the dialogue is incredibly well done and very fun to stop and listen to. Now this is an incredibly minor note, but in Wolcen at times, companion characters have a tendency to unexpectedly teleport ahead of, next to, or behind you in a way that is very reminiscent of Dr. Watson from the old Sherlock Holmes Crimes and Punishment game. For those that don't remember, Creepy Watson was essentially the prototype of Slender Man, except it was a meme years before Slender the 8 Pages came out. All memes aside though, it is a bit weird to frequently see your companion character just appear out of nowhere at times, especially without any kind of effect. It just looks like a glitch, something that shouldn't be there, making it all the creepier. At least with Diablo, the characters kind of had a bit of an effect around them when they ported to you, to at least attempt to hide the disrupting pop-in motion. Another aspect Wolcen does well is the soundtrack. The soundtrack for Wolcen is beautifully composed, and really nails down the epic tone and scale when it's supposed to, while also providing calmer, more relaxed melodies for the more peaceful hub world areas. I wish I could show you examples, but sadly with YouTube's Content ID systems, I don't dare take the risk. Even though I make no money from ads at the moment, I can still have my video's visibility limited, or have the video taken down altogether, and I would very much prefer to avoid that possible eventuality. But if you're into epic, cinematic-like fantasy soundtracks, I would definitely recommend listening to Wolcen. So my overall takeaway, Wolcen Lords of Mayhem is not necessarily a Diablo clone, at least not nearly to the same degree as other action RPGs try to be, and in fact it does do a decent job of improving on the foundations where Diablo in my opinion somewhat lacked. Satisfying blood and gore? Check. A compelling story that actually makes you somewhat give a damn about your character and supporting characters? Check. A loot system that mostly allows for experimentation instead of arbitrarily declaring certain weapons to be off limits? Check. Fully rendered cinematic cutscenes in addition to the usual text bubble-based conversations? Check. However, while Wolcen gets a lot of points in regards to presentation and style, the inconsistent optimization, the bugs and server outages, the inability to share character progress between online and offline play are all major detractors worth keeping in mind. Would I recommend buying this game for those interested in action RPGs? Yes, there is no hesitation in my mind. Odds are, if you liked or loved Diablo, you'll fall head over heels for this one too, no doubt. But for those who aren't interested in delving into deep RPG mechanics like managing cooldowns, upgrading skills, understanding and making the most out of your active and passive weapon and equipment stats, etc., you may require a bit more handholding than this game is ever willing to provide. It's worth noting that even in this long-form review video, I've not been able to cover every aspect of this game, but if I were to not hold myself back on behalf of any time constraints, this video could have easily been at least double its current length, and I simply cannot even begin to imagine editing something on that scale. On that note, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. Wolcen Lords of Mayhem is available on Steam for $39.99 USD, and after spending a number of hours in game, I can already say it's well worth the $40 asking price. It offers you more in-game content at launch than most $60 AAA games seem to offer nowadays. If you enjoyed this review, be sure to hit the like button down below. Also consider subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when new videos go live, since YouTube almost never seems to actually do their job and notify subscribers otherwise. What's your take on Wolcen Lords of Mayhem? Are you the type of person to be interested in action RPG games or no? There's no right or wrong answer here. At any rate, this is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, and peace out.
My name is Barry Allen, and I am the fastest man alive. To the outside world, I'm an ordinary forensic scientist, but secretly, I use my speed to fight crime and find others like me. And one day, I'll find who killed my mother and get justice for my father. I am the Flash.